Okay, so we've only gotten through 2 of yours, so let's keep going.
Whoa.
So
this is so much fun.
It is.
And I hope I think it is. I hope it's encouraging for you, any area of healing. It doesn't have to be just betrayal trauma or just trauma itself. It's the idea of saying some pain, some wound, something, and you're trying to release your life and say, I want to go forward. Here's some of the signs you can look for. There may be many more. These are just some of them. Am I stuck when we talk about the stages of grief or the stages of trauma? Am I stuck in any stage of grief? You'll know it because you will cycle. You feel like you're in a cul-de-sac. Because I keep going around and around and around. That looks like, or I keep going forward. I go boom, right back, like gravity. I tell people that gravity is like depravity. They both pull you down, right? So it's like I keep coming back and I keep coming back. Okay, so notice that. Am I struggling with, the scripture talks about a root of bitterness. Yeah. Am I struggling with bitterness or unforgiveness toward the person who traumatized me? Bitterness toward or unforgiveness toward God, like God, you, or even toward myself. Am I holding myself in a sense of contempt? And by the way, with that is, part of that is that goes on is again back to the brain, that if I am just bitter and unforgiving, and I didn't say go to quick forgiveness, fake forgiveness, but I'm doing that, I'm literally rewiring my brain away from Philippians 4:8, way away from that. And my brain, after a while, I can become literally, and as the old timer said, I'll get bitter, not better. I will stop and just stop on the side of the road.
I think this is a really important one to stop on again, because we're talking about the stages of healing. So if I'm stuck in bitterness, then I'm not healing. So what would be the example, the flip example? So if instead of being stuck in bitterness, we're moving forward in forgiveness, we're moving forward in what? And we already talked about releasing, so that's part of it, but what is sort of the opposite side?
Well, not quite reverse engineering it, but I've done a lot of experiential counseling, and what I mean with that is anything you can show me or you can tell me, you can show me. So the thing of that is, here's a quick one, interview bitterness. I'll do that with people and say, let's put bitterness, you play bitterness. What's bitterness trying to say? Bitterness will answer. It's wrong that they got by with that. They should pay for that. They've moved on to a whole new relationship. Right. And so God's not even judging them. It's like you reap what you sow, says God, but they're not reaping. So that idea is the injustice of it and the bitterness, and I'll feel it inside the old line that I will drink poison expecting the other person to get sick. Right. So I think that the opposite of that is saying, you know what, again, back to the whole understanding of grief and trauma and moving forward. Resiliency is the word, is to say, you know what, Lord, your word is true. Lysa has taught us from the word that we may not see the reaping of what they've sowed, but God was faithful. He'll not be my God. I turn that person over to you. Take them off my hook of injustice and put them on your hook. It might be a daily, it might be 90 days worth of prayers. God, I release that person to you. We have 2 Corinthians 10:5. How about verse 4? We demolish strongholds in our lives by what? Taking every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. Martin Luther, the great hymn writer and theologian, said it this way. Well, I can't keep those thought birds from flying over my head, but I can keep them from making a nest in my hair. So that idea is a daily ongoing inventory and say, Lord, I didn't mean you want me to pray for my abuser. That's a different story. I'm saying to say, Lord, I give that person over to you. I take that thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. It's a very important practice.
It really is. And I like to think of it as, I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here with the term bitterness. I think that bitterness does not necessarily want to just visit us. I don't think bitterness just wants to be a feeling. I think bitterness wants to become our only feeling. Wow. So that's part of the danger here. But playing devil's advocate, sometimes we can really just look down like, oh, like that person's so bitter, or, just bitterness is consuming me. And I think we need to remember that bitterness doesn't often visit cold-hearted people. Bitterness often wants to visit people who have dared to throw their arms open wide and love deep, so they got hurt deep.
That's right.
And it's in that space of emptiness that's created now because of the loss that we have to decide, what are we going to fill that space of loss with, because loss is a hunger. It's like a black hole that wants to pull something in to fill it. And it's our choice to fill it with bitterness, right? Or we can fill it with things that will lead us on to becoming better, not bitter, and toward healing. Some of the verses that I've been studying lately, just to remind myself, like, this isn't just a feeling. It might actually be a scheme of the enemy.
Come on. Yeah.
And so as I go through the Bible and I look at when are times where people were feeling bitter, or they just couldn't release the anger over a situation, or unforgiveness, I'm just going to read a couple verses, and I want you to watch what's always paired with this verse. In Genesis chapter 4, when we see the first sibling rivalry between Cain and Abel, Abel brings an offering that was pleasing to the Lord, and Cain brings an offering that was not pleasing to the Lord. And eventually what happens is Cain lets his anger overtake him, and he kills his brother. In between Cain getting angry and then reacting from his anger and killing his brother, the Lord actually comes and has a conversation with Cain. And it says it in Genesis 4:6. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." So we see those feelings of unresolved anger, those feelings of like bitterness. This isn't right, that the Lord accepted his and not mine, and that it's like blood in the water that draws sharks near. And so when someone has traumatized us and we hold on to bitterness, what we're really doing is allowing that trauma to hurt us again and again and again, because now sin is crouching at our door. And it's wanting to have us. And so the Lord is warning him, like, you must rule over this. Like, you didn't have the opportunity to prevent the original trauma from happening.
That's right.
But you can absolutely rule over how it affects you and not let sin overtake you. Then another example is in Matthew chapter 6, where the Lord is teaching us to pray. It's so fascinating to me. As part of the prayer, in verse 12, Jesus teaches us to pray, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. Verse 13, and, so it's a connection, and lead us not into temptation. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Again, dealing with forgiveness, and then sin is crouching at your door. Again, there's going to be a temptation there. It's like those things seem to be very closely connected. Even as I turn over to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, it says, "In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." Again, the devil is going to get a foothold if you lay in your bed and let that anger overtake you. And then the last one here is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. And starting in verse 10, it says, "Anyone you forgive, I also forgive. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake, in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes." So I see this pattern when we're holding on to bitterness and we're just refusing to move on into the healing work of forgiveness, that it's not just about the feeling of bitterness, but it's like putting blood in the water, and it just draws the sharks or the enemy close. And then what can happen is, in our anger, we might start sinning.
Of course.
In our bitterness, it might take us to places we never intended to go.
Yeah.
So bitter or better. And I like moving on. A sign of healing is when you decide, I'm not just having a feeling of bitterness, I feel bitterness overtaking me. And so now I've got to make the choice to rule over this. And I didn't get to choose how this other person treated me.
That's right.
But I absolutely get to choose where I go from here.
And, hey, we've got a good etiology is a fancy counseling word, origin, because there's old Cain, but look at his daddy. When God came in the garden and said, "What up? What's happened down here, dude? What'd you do?" And Adam said, it's that woman. Eve blamed the devil, the serpent at least. And then Adam said, it's that woman that you gave me. Cain did it. Cain did it here. The idea of I believe most of the time. Dare not say with Dr. Joel here all of the time. But when I am sinning, Oswald Chambers said, I sin because I have the suspicion that God is not good. That if I'm sinning toward a person or in bitterness, it goes right through that person. Adam, it's that woman you gave me. And I go up and I'm to buy one, get one free, that I'm also mad and bitter at God. Why would you allow this to happen? And get this person. Where's some justice? I mean, bring it today. And in our culture today, where you can't turn the TV on, we're not talking about injustice or justice.
Yeah.
So that piece is from Adam on. Romans 5:8, wherefore by one man's sin entered the world, and so death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. So that whole idea is to go, it comes in us naturally. It starts way, way back that we're mad, and I want to just honor an agreement of the thing of the only three enemies I see in the scriptures, the world, the flesh, and the devil. And the idea, I take it very, very seriously that I'm giving, back to what you did in Ephesians, the devil a foothold. I'm like saying, come in here, you and I will almost have an agreement with what goes on, and not knowing the whole time that this person perpetrated me, they've hurt me, and now I'm joining up in Satan, who is the accuser of the brothers and the sisters, and he's perpetrating me.
Yeah, Paul's language is the powers and principalities.
Powerful
in
stuff.
Ephesians. And it's interesting you say those three enemies, the world, the flesh, and the devil. I would expand the devil, and I know that's what you meant to say the evil powers at play. And interestingly, and this is all Paul's language, these evil powers at play are working in what? The flesh and the world. Right? And so we just have to be aware. The other thing that I thought of is with the Adam story and even Cain, ultimately what we have is a deflection of responsibility.
That's so big.
Bitterness ultimately is a deflection of some sense of responsibility for what we can own or what we can't own. It's a walking away of honesty. And what God wanted for Cain, when his face fell down, it's a Hebrew idiom for anxiety and depression. That's what that means, when his face fell. When that happened, God actually intervenes to protect Cain from the outcome that he knows is possible. And so we will never be tempted beyond what God will step in and help us to get out of the temptation. And yet there's still human agency. There's still human responsibility that we have to act upon.
And, we've talked about this word justice too. There is absolutely a place to identify this is a wrong in this world. I think we have to be careful that then in our experience with that, and even in fighting to make wrongs right, that there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. Coming from having your energy be bitterness because of what's happened to you is trying to do something right with something wrong driving that energy. And so we want to get right outcomes, but we want to move through it in right ways, in healthy ways. And so we're not saying that we can't fight the wrongs of this world. We're saying don't let the energy behind that or the motivation behind that to be bitterness, because that's trying to do something right with this wrong behind it.
Yeah, and nor is it for me being very vulnerable. We've all been vulnerable on this program before, but there are days I clearly have bitterness. But at that moment, I don't let it just linger. I say, okay, every moment of bitterness is an opportunity to go vertical with God and say, God, you're God and I am not. So the bitterness comes. I'm not worried about total eradication of that. But when the bitterness comes, I can look and say, Lord, once again, I surrender to you. They did get by with it. Yet I know with your truth, God, they didn't get by with it. It feels to me like, and the more I'm just watch, that's prayer. I'm talking conversationally with God. Suddenly I go, wake up, and I'm like, I don't feel so bitter. He says, yeah, tell me more. God says, bring it to me. That's back to Philippians 4 again. Your anxieties, whatever you've got, bring them. Your petitions, bring your petitions. Say, God, this feels unfair. I see David landing in those imprecatory psalms so many times, like, what are you doing, God? And then at the end, you're God and I'm not. And that piece is, so I'm not going to eradicate all bitterness, but when I see it, I say, Lord, that's an opportunity to go vertical with you.
That's so good. I think for me too, when I feel these feelings of bitterness, I will often say to myself, this is indication that more healing needs to happen.
Oh, wow.
And so it's not wrong for the bitterness to come up in me. It's that I don't want it to go down in me and become a root of bitterness that becomes a driving force in my life.
That's what we're calling these road signs of healing. Is the bitterness comes up and I go, okay, it's there. And that's a sign I need to do some more healing versus I'm going to get off the exit here at this roadside and go over here and just pout or, blame God, blame myself and whatever else. And I should have done things differently. Wish vengeance on the other person. It's like, okay, you've been there a little bit. Just get up. You remember that exit at the top of the hill? Over past, get back down the interstate where we get mile markers for healing and say, Lord, I'm kind of done. I need to get here and come out of my gourd, like Jonah or something. And say, Lord, I come out of my gourd there and victim mentality and poor me, not being rude to yourself and saying, I need to get back in. All right, Lord, let me get back on the highway and keep moving. Recovery, grief, all of it, whatever you want to call it, healing is always inviting us to go forward. You don't even have to do that much. The big thing is notice where you get stuck. That's why I said, are we stuck? Another one, am I connecting or reconnecting with, safe people? Most people aren't going to therapy. If you want to, great, I believe in it. But am I connecting to safe people who will remind me of who I really am? My release on life. This is who you really are. Will they say, I hear you. I do the hub, I hear you. Hey, I understand you and I believe you with what's gone on. Will they connect both in my pain and my healing, calling out the best parts of me? Maybe they've shared how they've healed. If it comes to it, sought out some good therapy. You can read, and all those things are good. But maybe you're at a point, I just need to get someone who's here who can help really guide me a little bit deeper down the line. A big one is, seems so simple, but how am I doing with my own self-care? How's my sleep? Am I up on the internet 40 hours a night trying to say, I hope that person gets paid back or whatever? Am I neglecting my health mentally, spiritually, emotionally? That's a big part of my healing is where are my proactive performables? Where am I showing up in the show up place to say, here's where I am spiritually. Emotionally, I'm doing here. Physically, radical self-care.
That's so good. And I think along with self-care too is what am I doing to move myself in the direction of healing?
Absolutely.
And sometimes, like I said earlier, it's harder to see the emotional healing. So am I moving myself toward more physical healing? Am I moving myself toward more spiritual healing? Because I think those three things work together. And sometimes if I've stalled out in my emotional healing, I can look and go, wow, honestly, I've kind of stalled out in my spiritual healing. I've kind of stalled out in my physical healing. So that self-care of like, am I drinking enough water? Am I moving my body? Am I choosing healthy things to eat relationally? Am I choosing healthy relationships? Sometimes when you've been in a relationship where you've been traumatized, it's easy to pick a new relationship that is actually the exact same or maybe even a little more damaging.
That's a scary thought.
And so it's like, you call it a picker, is my picker, or am I choosing more wisely and moving my life in the direction of wisdom and not foolishness?
And having a few people, Moses had Aaron and Hur, having some people like Nehemiah, life on the wall, that say, okay, we'll sit down, and you get that kind of tight personal board of directors. You get one. All of us do. And a board of directors and say, what do you see? Here's what's going on with me, or I'm with this new person in a relationship. This is how they're treating me. If you put your cards out on the table, which is a big theme of mine, literally I have people write 3x5 cards and put them on a real table in my office, and have your friends vet that and who are listening to you, you'd be surprised. They'll say, well, we hear this thought. We hear that sounds like a concern. Well, he said that, but he was probably having a bad night. We've done this rodeo before. It's like to go, and you have some people, so to go this alone in the new journey, this new lease on life you're on there, do that. And I'm going to say another one. Put into your vocabulary the words, of course. And what I mean by that's simple. You're going to cycle around. I'm not giving you a negative prophecy, but I'm telling you, you're going to cycle around, and PTSD, if you don't want to know that term, there's some level of post-traumatic stress you're going to come back. You're going to hear about a TV show, a movie, something on the news, a friend who got betrayed, and it's going to trigger you back up. That's okay. That's okay. And to say, why, of course, I can't believe I'm here. It's like, no, your new words are, well, of course I'm here. Jim Crest told me on this video thing, we've talked about it. It's like, yeah, I'm back. Now what I want to do with it, I got to get back in the arena and say, what's my plan? Who are my people I need to call? What do I need to do? What do I need to? Hebrew here, brother, we've talked about on this show. Zakar, remember. The remembering one. The Jews all know that term. I need to remember God's called me. He's called me to remember that in Passover and in the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. I need to remember and say, what do I need to remember? And if I forget, I'm going to call Joel and say, remind me. And that's in Nehemiah, real quick, in Nehemiah, where Nehemiah said, you're going to get scared. We're separated on the wall. You feel lonely. Set it right there. You need to have a rally cry. He's got a guy with a trumpet that's going to blow it. You need to ask for your own rally cry. Call Joel and say, dude, remind me who I am. I know who I am, but I need to hear it from you. And you say, Jimbo, this is who you are. This is what's true. You need a rally cry to remind you. We prepare in times of weakness. Start over. We prepare in times of strength for those coming times of weakness. And if you feel this coming on and you're getting off the road of these healing pathways, call somebody and say, tell me who I am. Remind me.
Yeah, so good. That brings me to, obviously Genesis. Everything goes back to Genesis 1 and 2.
Of course.
But Adam and Eve, why was it so necessary? We've talked about this often. Why it's so necessary for the one thing that was not good of all of creation, for Adam to be lonely, to not have a partner. And I think it's because of this, Jim.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't look at the animals and see the image of God and the glory of God and the presence and promise of God. And so it was with Eve, when he was able to look at her, that he would see the image of God, the full image of God, the goodness of God, the glory of God, the virtue and power and presence of God that is then reflected back upon him.
So good. So if you have walked through significant hurts, woundings, traumas, disappointments, in other words, if you're human,
Come on.
right? I hope today's show will help you not get lost in the disillusionment of all the many emotions that have to be processed and worked through. And you could use today's show as a helpful tool to recognize these are the mile markers of healing. So thank you, guys.
Can I end with a verse?
Please do.
Isaiah 53, 3-5, because there may be some skeptics out there that are wondering, is it even possible to overcome my grief? And I just want to give you a macro of why it's possible. And this is why. Because he, Jesus, was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. You could highlight and circle that word. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised. And we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteem him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. The Hebrew word there for grief, it's actually talking about sickness. Sometimes I think when we talk about grief, we think